Section 12 of Atlantic Narratives, Modern Short Stories, published 1918 by the Atlantic Monthly Press. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Moth of Peace by Katharine Fullerton Gerould. Anne Marmont, of old the pupil of the nuns, had told her about Andecy, an ancient place, half manor, half farm, in the Marne Valley, whence you could walk over a wind-swept plain to the battlefields of the 100 Days. The nuns, being exiled, of course can't keep it up any longer, and no one wants to buy. I remember it as a place of heavenly peace, though in my day they used to make the oldest and crossest nun in the order superior at Andecy. However, Madame Françoise de Paul is dead now, and there aren't any nuns anyhow. Do take it, dear, if you want quiet. Anne Marmont swept her arms out as if to embrace illimitable horizons. Nothing but a church spire or a clump of trees to be seen from edge to edge of the plain. The unstable ocean is nothing to it. And if you want variety, you can walk over to Champaubert and look at the house where Napoleon stayed the night before the battle. Riddled with bullet holes it is. There used to be a foolish ancient there who remembered the 100 Days. He's dead now, I suppose, but then so is Madame Françoise de Paul, thank heaven, and her cane too. I hope they buried the cane. Do take it, darling. It's dirt cheap, and my dear nuns would be so pleased. They'd probably send the money to the new Nicaragua convent. And Miss Stanley had gone to Andecy, had been conquered by the insuperable peace of the plain, and had set up her little household. No place that she had ever seen seemed so good to wait in. When Edmund Laye came back from the Argentine to marry her, she would submit to London. But already she had hopes of enticing him to Andecy for the honeymoon. The chill of the slow spring warmed her northern blood. She liked the reluctance of the season's green, the roaring fire that met her in the salon, the sharp cold click of her boots on the brick-paved corridor. She was well cared for. A Protestant and a foreigner, who was, none the less, a mysterious well-wisher of ces dames. She found a shy allegiance springing up about her steps as she traversed the plain. There was always a hot galette for her at La Vieille Andecy, an obsequious curtsy at Congy Chateau from the housekeeper, who showed with mumbling pride the bed where Henri IV had slept, and a welcoming smile from Saint Eloi, that holy humorist, in the Champaubert chapel. She sat until twilight, often, on the sinister shore of l'Autan des Loups. Even the legended Croix Jeanne, leaning against its pine thicket, seemed glad of her awkward Protestant dip. It was a good place, and all for the price of a second-rate hotel splotched with Baedekers. Loneliness, in the sense of removal from the social scene, did not afflict her. She who shrank almost morbidly from human encounters had no fear of the peasants. Slim, shy, timorous, she felt safe here. Her terrors were all of people and what people could do to her. The plain ignored her self-distrust. Letters came from Edmund regularly, if you granted the delay of driving to Cezanne to fetch them. The months rounded slowly, punctually to winter and her marriage. So might a châtelaine have waited, powerless but trusting. Then, in full summer time, the lightning struck, choosing again the Montmirail plain after 100 years' respite. The first rumors were vague and vivid, all detail and no substance, like news in the Middle Ages. There was war, and she scarcely knew more. Jacques or Etienne turned overnight into a reservist, and departed. But had it not been for that, she would hardly have known. The 2 maidservants whom she had brought with her clamoured for Paris. She gave them money and had them driven to Cezanne. After the mobilization, they must have got through, for she never heard again. It did not occur to her to strike out, herself, for the capital, for her common sense told her she was better off where she was until Paris had cleared the decks for action. Besides, Paris frightened her. She hated being jostled in streets. She resented even a curious stare. Old Marie and her husband, with their grandchild, came up from their cottage to the manor to sleep, and with the son and nephew gone, there was nothing for them to do but potter about rheumatically in her behalf. For many days the click of the rosary was never stilled among the corridors of Andecy. And still the rumours grew, terror capping terror, until it seemed that even at Andecy blood might rain down at any moment from the arched heaven. At first Miss Stanley forced herself to drive the fat donkey into Cezanne for news. A half-day's trip, with only more terror at the end. The feeble crowds beset the bulletins posted outside the mairie, and scattered, murmuring their own comments on the laconic messages. Sometimes crones and half-grown children on the edge of the crowd got her to report to them, as she emerged from the denser group in front of the mairie wall. She did so as gently as she could, for they were all involved. Fathers, husbands, sweethearts, brothers, sons, were facing the enemy at some point or other that only the War Office knew. If some creatures had had nothing to give, it was only because the Prussians had taken all they had in '70. There was no insane terror. The people were strangely calm, yet they and theirs had been, of all time, the peculiar food of the enemy, and there was pessimism afloat. The plain was as defenceless as they, its mild crops as foreordained to mutilation by feet and hoofs and wheels as they to splintering shells. Miss Stanley, who was so shy of unfamiliar action, felt Cezanne too much for her. She stopped going after a week, and resigned herself to not knowing. She chafed under the censorship, though she knew that Edmund Laye would tell her that it was well done of the powers that were to staunch the leakage of news as you would staunch blood from an artery. The General Staff was better off not drained of its vital facts. To be sure, Miss Stanley never read newspapers. Even less did she subscribe to them. But she longed now for a neutral America, where the extras came hot and hot, where experts of every kind fought out the battles on the front page, and good journalese stimulated the lax imagination. Her determination to go no more to Cezanne led her for exercise to other quarters of the plain. She would walk quickly, tensely for an hour, her eyes fixed on a clump of trees or a church spire far ahead of her at the end of the unswerving road, until the clump and the spire rose up to match her height, and she came to the first whitewashed cottage. Champaubert Church was never empty these days of worshippers who gazed up at gaudy Saint Eloi as if he could help. The crops that waved on the old Montmirail battlefield were thinly harvested by women and an impeding fry of children. The steep little streets of Congy were dirtier than ever, and the ducks and the infants plashed about more indiscriminately in the common mud puddles. No more galettes at La Vieille Andecy. The old woman was prostrated by the loss of her reservist grandson. Finally she gave up the plain too, and withdrew into Andecy itself, waiting, always waiting, for word of Edmund Laye. There had been a touch of loyalty to him in her staying on without plan of escape. News of him would reach her here sooner than elsewhere. If she left, she would be lost in a maelstrom, and might lose some precious word. Until she heard from Edmund of his sailing, or of a change of plan, she would stay where he thought of her as being. When she heard, she would go. Some atavistic sense in Miss Stanley caused her to look, all through early August, to the provisioning of the manor, some dim instinct to hoard food that might have sprung from the heart of a colonial ancestress behind a stockade of logs, premonition against death and savages. She sent old Marie to buy thriftily, making it clear that her fortress was not for herself alone, but for all who might be in need. Together she and Marie and the granddaughter piled provisions in the empty rooms and the dark cellars, and they lived frugally on milk and eggs and soup aux choux. Sometimes she wondered whether the danger was not a mere fixed idea of the foolish peasants, who had all been touched in the wits by 70. True, the able-bodied men were gone, but the reports these people brought her made no sense. Their quality verged on folklore. Something gigantic was going on, somewhere, but it had nothing to do with Edmund Laye in the Argentine, or with her at Andecy. Paris in danger? Perhaps, but how to take it on their word? Belgium flowing with blood? Just what did it mean? An aeroplane over Cezanne at dawn? It must often have happened. Allez! The air was never free nowadays. The Germans in France? They had been seeing Germans behind every bush for 40 years. So she talked with old Marie, scarcely sure whether she or old Marie were the fool. Since the household no longer drove the fat donkey to Cezanne, none of them knew even what the War Office said, unless what old Séraphine from the next farm reported that her granddaughter had heard in Champaubert from a woman whose married daughter had been to Cezanne 2 days before, could be called a War Office report. And never from the first, on the plain of Andecy, had anyone understood why. According to the plain, all things were to be believed of the German emperor, who was usually drunk. But on the other hand, who could trust an atheist government? The soil of the 100 Days had never recovered from Bonapartist tendencies, Miss Stanley had often noted, and even old Marie would sometimes mix up 15 and 70. The white paper, which Miss Stanley had never heard of, would have been wasted on Champaubert and Montmirail. Wonder stirred at last even in old Marie's fatalistic mind at the lack of panic in this shy young foreigner, who could not chaffer, who could not bully, who could not endure even the mimic urbanity of Cezanne. Strange that she should be willing to stay quietly pacing up and down the cobbled courtyard of Andecy for soul exercise. Past mid-August, Marie put a vague question. "When I hear from him, I shall go, Marie," Miss Stanley answered. "But I leave everything here to you and Théophile. The British fleet holds the sea, they say, and I shall be better off in England. I shall surely come back when the war is over, and perhaps I shall bring my husband with me." Some dim, muscular effort deepened the wrinkles in the old woman's face. It was as if a knife had cut them in the living flesh. "I hope so, if Théophile and I are here. To be sure, you must go where it is your duty. We will keep such of the provisions as can be kept." "Keep nothing. It is all for you who have been so kind to me, you and yours. Not a child, not a creature for a dozen miles about that I would not wish to share with, as you know. But listen, Marie." Miss Stanley blushed faintly as she bent her head nearer Marie's good ear. "It is my duty. My first duty, that is, must be to my future husband. When he returns from America," she had long ago learned the futility of distinguishing for Marie between l'Amérique du Nord and l'Amérique du Sud, and was patient with her belief that New York was a suburb of Cayenne. "He will wish me there. He was to have sailed last month. A letter, a telegram, must have gone astray in the confusion. When I hear, he will doubtless be in England. And when he reached England, I was to go to my friends and be married to him. My heart bleeds for France, but I am not French, and my duty is not here. I am American, you see, dear Marie, and my fiancé is English." "Ah," Marie shook her head. "My old head is turned with all they tell me, and the buzzing in my bad ear is like cannon. But I had thought that the English, for some reason I do not understand, were fighting with us. They have been telling us for 10 years that we do not hate the English, that we love them. And Théophile thought that an English army was against the Germans. But perhaps I am wrong. Monsieur votre fiancé will not have to fight then? I congratulate you, mademoiselle." "The English are fighting with the French, Marie, but all Englishmen are not soldiers. Monsieur Lay is not a soldier, he is an engineer." "He is perhaps past the age." "There is no conscription in England, Marie. No man is a soldier unless he chooses." "No service to make?" "None." "C'est beau, ça. All Frenchmen must fight. So England may go to war, and still have men to till the fields. But where do their armies come from?" "Any man who wishes may go, but none are compelled, except the soldiers by profession. There will be enough, never fear. England will not desert France." The old woman nodded. "I am not afraid of that. And you are not afraid that monsieur le fiancé will fight?" "I do not understand these things. As Théophile says, what I comprehend I do not hear, and what I hear I do not comprehend. I go to fetch mademoiselle's soup. They are lucky, all the same, to get the crops in time of war." She clattered from the room. Miss Stanley felt her heart grow heavy. She did not know precisely why. If only word would come. Perhaps she was a fool to stay. There must be trains through to Paris now. Anything to get nearer Edmund, away from this historic, war-bound plain. She crouched by the window to eat her soup aux choux and stale bread. If only some boy would come riding into the courtyard with a letter for her! She had bribed half the urchins who loitered by the mairie in Sézanne to rush to her hot-foot with anything that came. The lightning that had struck once at Champaubert and Montmirail was to strike again before she heard from Edmund Laye. Suddenly, with no warning, the heavens opened with that reiterant flash. Frightened stragglers over the plain, refugees from the north pushing on from beyond Sézanne in a blind, stumbling dash to the southward. Rumors that sprang up out of the ground, so that she had but to stand still to hear the world move. Indescribable distant noises, commotions less seen than sensed on the far horizon. A casual smudge of aeroplanes on the great blue round of heaven. An earth, for no visible reason, tumultuously vibrating beneath her. And then, at last, one hot noon, a frightened boy falling exhausted at her feet. She gave him the piece of gold which for many days had been waiting for him in her pocket, and bade him rest where he lay until he was ready for food. Marie and Théophile crouched beside him, listening to his winded babbling. Armies, armies, fighting, men riding on horses, guns and wounded, like 15, like 70, like hell. People like themselves, leaving their cottages and farms, making, with such portable treasures as they had, food, relics, poultry, babes in arms, for the shelter of a town. No town could avail them, for in the town sat the officers, and the market-place offered only a bigger, a more organized destruction. But the hope of shelter would take them far afield. Anything was better than to see sabres splintering your walls, and a greasy flame replacing all that had been ancestral and intimate. Better to die in the open with friends, not smoked out of your own cellar to fall on a bayonet. They knew the secular ways of war. The dwellers on the plain were the foredoomed type of the refugee the world over. Once in so often men fought, and poor people were homeless. And now none of the Vieux de la Vieille were there to guard. These were the visions that assembled in Miss Stanley's brain, while Marie, her lean fists clenched, reported the boys' wild talk. The lumps of fat hardened on her congealing soup, and still her mind went painfully, shuttle-wise, back and forth from her telegram, infinitely delayed but clearly authentic, to the apocalyptic events surrounding her. Like most Americans perpetually defended by two oceans, Miss Stanley had no conception of invasion as a reality. The insult of an enemy on your own ground was one which she had never steeled herself to meet. There was no weapon in her little arsenal for a literal foe. Her knees trembled under her as she rose to look out of the window after Marie, spent with eloquence, had left her. Edmund Laye, by this, was with his regiment, even she might not know where. No point in trying to break through to London. His telegram, dated the day of his arrival in England, was already too old. The letter he promised her would go the way of all the letters he must have written, that she had never had. And she herself was caught. She had waited too long on that predestined plain. The noises she heard seemed rumblings of the earth and cracklings of the inflamed sky. Andecy Manor had not yet seen one soldier, unless you reckoned the pilots of those soaring monoplanes. But their hours were numbered. Soon, any moment now, all that hidden rumor would break forth into visible fruit of fighting men. Men with rifles, men with lances, men with mitrailleuses or howitzers. She was trapped. To try, even with no luggage, to make the miles to Sézanne would be not so much to take her life in her hands as to kick it from her. Caught, and her nervous nostrils feigned for her a subtle odor of smoke. She turned from the window and went to the quiet room that had once been the chapel. Out of those windows she could not look, thank heaven. The life of the Virgin, in villainous stained glass, barred her vision. She was absolutely alone. Old Marie and Théophile were not people. They were strangers, creatures, animals, what not, she scarcely knew. Allies meant nothing to her at the moment but marching men. Even Edmund, who would be killed unless they hid in caves and let their beauty rot in the dark. Fool that she had been not to go to England while there was time. Fool that she had been to forget that Edmund Laye, landing in England, would be first of all a territorial, one of the thousands of slim reeds on which Kitchener was so heavily leaning. She had been obsessed with peace, sure that war could not touch her, or what was privately, supremely hers. She was a creature of peace, a little doctrinaire who supposed that, in the inverted moral world in which she walked, right made might. There was a deal of most logical self-pity in her tears. How did any of it concern her, that she should be cooped in a country manor to await horrors from unknown people? Why should Edmund Laye, who had chosen an antipodal career, be dragged back to present himself as a mark for some Prussian shell? The senselessness of it angered her. Nations meant little to her, the cosmos nothing. Alone in the chapel she treated herself to a vivid personal rage. And still the strange tumult, that was more than half made of vibrations too slow for sound waves, beat upon her nerves like an injury to the internal ear. By twilight the physical need of action came to her. She felt, in the subtler fibres of her mind, that if she stayed longer there, half prone in her worm-eaten armchair, grovelling mentally in this welter of concrete alarms, she should sink into a pit whence reason could not rescue her. She had been so calm in her folly, so lulled by the sense of her sacred detachment from this bloody business, so sure that neutrality protected you from fire and steel even in the thickest mêlée, she could not have been more ridiculous if she had worn a dress cut out of the stars and stripes. Now some obscure inhibition told her she must act. She must move her hands and feet, limber her cramped muscles, set the blood flowing properly in her veins, make herself physically normal, or her worthless mind would let her go mad. She must not think of death or outrage or torture. She must forget the things she had heard those first days at Sézanne. She must forget the gossip of Marie and Théophile and Séraphine, inventing, with a medieval prolixity and a racial gift for the macabre, on chill evenings by the fire. They had no need of news. They dug up out of the bloody deeps of the past things the like of which she had never expected to hear. She must forget, shut her staring mouth and forget. Whatever visited itself on Andecy must not find a gibbering mistress there. Perhaps, if she pretended that Edmund knew, moment by moment, what she was doing, she could master her faltering flesh and her undisciplined mind. She had lost him forever, but she would try to be some of the things he thought her. Edmund Lay had called her flower-like. Well, flowers were broken, but they did not go mad. She must be decent. Her brisk pacing of the chapel did not allay her fears, but it brought back to her a sense of decorum. Her body had never lent itself to an immodest gesture. What, she caught at the notion, could be more immodest than visible fear? So, gradually, by artificial means, she brought herself back into some dignity, scolding and shaking herself into a trooper's demeanor. She could not trust her mind, but perhaps she could get her instincts into fighting form. Cautiously she tried them, as you try a crazy foothold to see if it will bear your weight. Her muscles seemed to respond. Suppleness, strength, coordination were reported satisfactory. She thought she could promise not to fall a shivering again. The noise in her ears faded. The vibrations ceased to rock her nerves. Miss Stanley flung open the chapel door and walked firmly, ignoring echoes, down the brick-paved corridor to the kitchen. Marie, Théophile, and little Jean watched, in a kind of apathy, the pot on the fire. In the dim corners of the big kitchen, Miss Stanley thought she saw strange figures. Inspection revealed a few frightened women and children from farms that had once been dependencies of Andecy. Here was something to do, more blessed exercise for hands and feet. You, Françoise, and the little ones? And you, Mathilde, and the girl? Good. It is time the children had food and went to bed. We must economize candles, so we will all eat here. The dining room, in half an hour, will be a dormitory. Jean shall sleep in my room. Milk and gruel for the little ones, Marie, and soup aux choux for the rest of us. Milk we will use while we have it, eggs also. We cannot expect to keep the livestock forever. Bread we have not, until I bake it in my own fashion. It may come to that. Jean, you will eat with us older ones. Come and help me make beds for the children. Luckily there are cots for a whole community. In half an hour, she took out her watch, the babies sup and say their prayers. Tomorrow I prepare the chapel and the pupils' old dormitory for wounded. Wounded there will be, if what we hear from Cézanne, though they are all fools in Cézanne, from the fat mayor down, be true. My fiancé is at the front. We wait here for our men, hein? And she beckoned to Jean. She had made her speech blindly, recklessly planning as she spoke, thinking that if she could convince her hearers, she could perhaps convince herself. She looked for the effect on them when she had done. The speech had worked. If it worked for them, it must work for her too. It could not be madness if it had lighted up those sodden faces. And as she looked from one to another, she saw a flicker of pride, of patriotism, reflected in their eyes. Reflected from what? From her, without doubt. There must have been pride in her voice and glance when she spoke of Edmund Laye. Good! That was the line to take. There should be a brave show. She would work her muscles to death to keep it going. Every due emotion should be cultivated in each limb and feature. Every surface inch of skin should play its part. The drum and fife should play all the more bravely because her heart was hollow. Perhaps, if she got a fair start, a fine physical impetus toward courage, she could keep it up to the end. "Come, Jean," she beckoned the child. The women stirred, and the children, huddled against their skirts, crept out upon the floor. "Théophile, is the great gate locked?" The old man shook his head vaguely. He had gone near to losing his few wits with the rumors from Sézanne, which his ears had drunk up so greedily. His shaken mind was wandering windily about in reminiscences of '70 and legends of '15. "It had best be locked at once. The lantern, Jean. Come." The child looked at her piteously. "Oh, very well." Miss Stanley pushed her gently aside. "I shall not need it. There is still light enough. Fetch the bowls for the babies, Jean. We must all get to bed, and be up with the dawn." Alone she left the house and crossed the innumerable cobblestones of the huge courtyard to the outer gate. She knew the way of the heavy bolts and bars, for she had often escorted Théophile on his rounds before the official coucher of the household. But her shaking fingers tapped the rusty iron ineffectually. She loathed her fingers. Insubordinate little beasts! She struck her right hand smartly with her left with her right, to punish them with real pain. The fingers steadied. She drove the foolish, antiquated bolts home. Something white fluttered about her feet in the twilight. The hands had not been shut up. Miss Stanley was very angry for a moment with Théophile, then angry with herself for her anger. Théophile was frightened because he knew. '70 had been the moment of his prime. She did not know. She had no right to be frightened. Tales of the Civil War, she remembered now, had always bored her. She had never listened to them. Her duty now was to secure the poultry. They must have eggs while they could, and chicken broth for the children. Mathilde's little girl was a weakling. So she ran hither and yon, trying to drive the silly handful toward the little grange where they were kept. With traditional idiocy they resisted, and the last stragglers she lifted and imprisoned ruthlessly in her skirt. She hated the creatures. To touch them made her flesh crawl, but at last she got them all in, squawking, and fastened the door upon them. How like the stupid things, to make extra trouble because there was a war! Her anger against them was quite serious, and sank into proper insignificance only when her task was done. A stone wall, continuing the house wall all the way round, bounded the courtyard. But through the grille she could see rocket-like sputters of flame far off on the horizon, and here and there a patch of light in the sky which meant fires burning steadily beneath. The pounding vibrations had ceased. There was trouble, a mighty trouble, upon them all. And with the dawn, perhaps, all the things those chattering fools by the fire had spent their phrases on. Strangest of all to her was the sudden thought that Edmund, separated from her now by the innumerable leagues of destiny, might be, as the crow flies, not so far away. A few fatal miles might be replacing, even now, the friendly, familiar ocean, whose division of the lovers had been a mere coquetry of time. On that thought she must not dwell. Besides, irony returned to her at last. Did she not gather from those idiots within that all soldiers one ever saw were Germans? One's own armies were routed somewhere, but one encountered, one's self, only the victors, ever. Then the jealous captain to whom she had given the command reminded her that such reflections meant mutiny. Slim, straight, hollowed out with fear, but walking delicately ahead, she went back to the house and superintended the baby's supper. Then the grown-ups ate, standing about the table as at the Passover, faces half averted toward the door, and she marshaled them all to their appointed sleeping places. Marie and Théophile abdicated their dominion with an uncouth relief. If Mademoiselle, so shy, so small, could be so sure of what they ought to do, doubtless hers was a great brain in a frail form. After prayers, in which Miss Stanley herself joined, borrowing a chapelet, they went off to snore peacefully in the guardianship of that great brain so opportunely discovered. "You have not an American flag?" old Marie asked as she shuffled off. Théophile, past any coherent reflections, was mumbling over the dying fire. "No, nothing of the sort. I am sorry. I should use it if I had." "You could not make one?" "Impossible to night. To morrow I will see." Marie apologetically offered a last suggestion to the great brain. "A white flag? It would do no harm to have it ready. Françoise swears they are in saison to night." "I will see. Allez-vous coucher?" And Miss Stanley turned on her heel and sought the little room where Jeanne was already restlessly dreaming. Save the babies, Andecy found no deep sleep that night. The old people napped and woke and napped again, according to their habit. The mothers rose and walked beside their children's cots, then fell limply back and dozed. Miss Stanley slept from sheer exhaustion until an hour before dawn. Then she rose and dressed herself, and when dressed, sent Jeanne to wake her grandparents. Whatever the day might bring, it should not find them either asleep or fasting. They would eat, if it was to be their last meal. Alone in her room, by candlelight, Miss Stanley made a white flag out of a linen skirt. She sewed hastily but firmly, that it might be no flimsier than she could help. By the first streaks of daylight she groped for and found, in a lumber room, a long stick to fasten it to. Probably, it flashed across her, Madame Françoise de Paul's cane, never buried, as Anne Marmont had hoped. When the flag was finished, she loathed it, loathed its symbolism, loathed its uselessness. No, whatever happened, she would have nothing to do with that. What could be more humiliating than to hold up a white flag in vain? Another idea came to her, and while breakfast was preparing and the children were being dressed, she carried it swiftly into execution. Slashing a great cross out of a scarlet cape, she sewed it firmly to the white ground. That she might hang to the dovecot, after breakfasting. She carried it martially with her into the great kitchen and placed it in a corner. The sun itself was hardly up, but the children brought the flag out into the firelight, and old Marie was jubilant. The wonderful idea! The great brain of Mademoiselle! She fussed almost happily over the simmering skillet of milk. But the great brain was pondering apart in the lessening shadows. Better the American flag if she could manage it. She would beg an old blue smock of Théophile's, for she had nothing herself. Those wretched stars! It would take her a long morning. And she felt convinced that this day's sun would not rise peacefully to the zenith. This thing she had made was a lie. Incalculable harm could be done by assuming a badge you had no right to. Incalculable harm to those who had the right. She was mortally afraid, but she would not do anything in pure panic. That would make it worse for everyone in the end. An American flag. It must be made. How many states were there? She had no notion, but she fancied they were as the sands of the sea. It would take a woman all day to cut out those stars and sew them to a blue field hacked out of Théophile's smock. And what a makeshift banner in the end! Even if the enemy politely waited for her to finish it, would they not detect it at once? Was not that the kind of thing every German knew better than she? How many little silly stars there were, safe and far away, sending senators to Washington? A sullen tide of mirth was let loose in her far below the surface. Here she was, quivering with terror, with a lot of foolish livestock on her hands, livestock that she could not give up to slaughter as if they had been the sheep that they really were. Miss Stanley caught up one of the children to her lap and fed it great spoonfuls of warm milk, choking it hopelessly. Luckily the mother was too apathetic to reproach her. She could not even feed a child without wetting it all over. Disgusted, she put the child down again. It whimpered, and the mother, roused, moved over to it. Miss Stanley looked at her cup. Chocolate. No coffee, for the coffee was gone. Coffee might have cleared her brain, but this mess would do nothing for her. Still she drank it. And gradually, as their hunger was appeased, they crept about her. Even those who did not move their chairs turned and faced her. She could not meet so many eyes. She had nothing to do with them, these tellers of old wives' tales, who expected her to deliver them from the horrors their own lips had fabricated. Why did they stare at her as if she might have an idol's power over events, whispering, almost inaudibly, their strung and beaded prayers, yet blasphemously looking to her? The shadow still lessened in the great kitchen. The sun lay in level streaks on the centre of the stone floor, and even the twilight in the corners was big with noon. The women sat in a helpless huddle, not knowing how to go about the abnormal tasks of the abnormal day. The far-off thunders of the plain began again. vibrations as of earthquake first, then explicit sounds, unmistakable and portentous. To-day you could distinguish among those clamors. Miss Stanley, with the first sounds, expected to have a tiny mob to quell, but their apathy did not leave them. Even the children turned that steady, hypnotized stare on her. And then Jean, how could she not have missed Jean from the assembly, ran down the corridor with a sharp clatter. "They are there! Soldiers! On horseback! At the gate!" And indeed now, in the sudden tragic hush, Miss Stanley could hear the faint metallic thrill and tinkle of iron bars, at a distance, struck sharply. Old Théophile roused himself as if by unconscious antediluvian habit, but Marie plucked him back and ran for the flag with the scarlet cloth cross. This she thrust into the American girl's hand. No one else moved, except that Mathilde flung her heavy skirt over her little girl's head. For one moment Miss Stanley stood irresolute. She had never dreamed of such a tyranny of irrelevant fact. She must, for life or death, for honor at all events, respond to a situation for which nothing since her birth had prepared her. Peace had been to her as air and sunlight, the natural condition of life. This was like being flung into a vacuum. It was death to her whole organism. Yet somehow she was still alive. Irony took her by the throat, and then the thought of Edmund Laye, linked himself with events like these, riding or marching beneath just such skies, on just such a planet, under just such a law. Never had there been, really, immunity like that which she had fancied to be the very condition of human existence. It was all human, with a wild inclusiveness that took her breath. And, whatever happened, paralysis like that which even now crept slowly up her limbs was of the devil. Against that last ignominy she braced herself. Her muscles responded miraculously to her call for help, and she felt her feet moving across the floor. If feet could move, hands could. She rolled up the little banner and threw it in the very center of the fire. It occurred to her as a last insult that she did not know enough German even to proclaim her nationality. But she did not falter again. Some residuum of human courage out of the past kept her body loyal, some archaic fashion of the flesh that dominated the newness of the mind. Past generations squared her shoulders for her, and gave her lips a phrase to practice. As she passed down the corridor, she flung each door wide open. She paused, a mere fraction of an instant, in the big front door of the house, but from there she could see only a confusion of helmets and horses nosing at the grill. Almost immediately she passed through the door and walked, hatless, her arms hanging stiffly at her sides, across the innumerable cobblestones to the gate. And a Moth of Peace. Biographical and Interpretative Notes by Charles Swain Thomas. Mrs. Katharine Fullerton Gerould, distinguished as a writer of essays and stories and novels, is the wife of Gordon Hall Gerould, professor at Princeton. Aside from the unusually strong and flowing style here so impressively revealed, we have a story marked by a sympathetic penetration into the atmosphere of Andecy, an atmosphere, when first felt, richly laden with the languor of a lonely and pervading provincial peace. This peace is suddenly broken by the rumors and processes of war, and we feel the dread of the impending German attack and the personal solicitude of Miss Stanley, the American heroine, lovingly anxious for the fate of her English fiancé. Nearer and nearer comes the threatened danger. Finally, the heroine goes out to meet the troop of enemy soldiers without the gates. Whether to meet a tragic end, the author does not say. There is little dialogue and little haste in the action. The narrative is continuously guided by the controlling spirit of Miss Stanley, who grimly triumphs over the fear and dread of the perilous situation. Her body may have suffered defeat, her soul is splendidly victorious. The author's skill at the end is finally revealed in the graphic portrayal of the psychology of the situation. End of Section 12.